fill-in guy today on this one as well. Ranking Member Portman, thank you for your leadership in the committee as well. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the hearing. And again, thank you to all the witnesses today for the process. I do want to follow up what Ranking Member Portman was talking about on the Equal Rights Amendment. Dr. Shogan, during your process in your consideration as a nominee, did anyone from the Biden administration ask you about your stand on the ERA, what your position was on that in the approval process? And if so, what was that conversation?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I was not asked that question during the process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your very clear statements, both to our staff in writing and to Senator Portman, that the issue with the ERA is settled by the federal courts or by Congress, not by the archivist, or the archivist, as you say on it, either way. So we want to make that very clear, because obviously there are members of Congress that have disagreement on that. The previous archivist disagreed and said, no, this is not the role of the archivist to unilaterally make that decision. You've obviously agreed with that publicly, and I appreciate your engagement on that. You and I have spoken before about a warning label that is currently on our founding documents, that is actually on every document that is digitized in the National Archives. In the consideration, it warns Americans or anyone reading our documents that there's potentially harmful content, that this content could be offensive to individuals, that whether it's the United States Constitution or whether it's autopsy photos from World War II, it doesn't matter, it's on everything, as that warning piece on that banner on it. My question to you in our conversation was, I don't want to be misunderstood in any way, that the National Archives could consider the United States Constitution a potentially offensive document, which clearly it's a founding document, it's not offensive. There are bits of our history that all of us as Americans look back on and are embarrassed who we were as Americans and decisions that we have made. We don't always get it right over our history, but we are working to make a more perfect union. But all of our history is our history. The important thing to me is there's never a warning on a single document, and that we reconsider labeling some of our documents offensive when they're just our history on this. So as you and I have spoken about this before, my challenge is to be able to review that warning, to be able to determine what's the best way to be able to do it, what's appropriate to be able to get to parents, to say if your children are looking at all these things, there are photos that are gruesome photos from World War II, for instance, of the battlefield and the Civil War, that are painful to be able to view, especially as a child. But there's also important national documents that are here. How do you plan to be able to handle this offensive label and this warning?
Yes, Senator, thank you for that question. You are correct. When there is a search done in the archives, the online archives catalog, there is language that makes users aware that they may inadvertently come across content that could be difficult to view. As we talked about yesterday in your office, I am primarily concerned about, if I am confirmed as archivist, I want more teachers and students to use the National Archives. If you have to do a history project on World War II or World War I, we want you to come to the National Archives and use that catalog to find those primary sources. And as you know, kids are excellent searchers today. They're better searchers than we are. So when they look for those relevant documents, they could easily jump to something else inadvertently. And so that's why that language is there. But as we talked about yesterday, I am absolutely willing to come and talk to you about that language, and we can review it together and move forward.
Okay, thank you. As you and I both know, being around teenagers, all you have to do is put a warning that this could be offensive, and that makes them search it more, as you also know. So that's another issue we need to evaluate, and just evaluate what the effectiveness of this is, to have a warning label on it, if that's really accomplishing anything on it, other than just being a distraction. You and I also spoke about the raid that happened in Mar-a-Lago, former President Trump's private residence, and going through those documents. In an unusual situation, it wasn't just the FBI carrying out the raid, but it was the request of the National Archives to be able to engage with these records and then trigger something with the FBI. Typically, this would be a voluntary conversation. It's my understanding that you've had dialogue with our staff to say all of your preferences, any disagreements in this document, this should be a voluntary conversation rather than a legal conversation or a raid. A raid of a former president's house is unprecedented, and it puts the entire process on full display to be able to say, how does this happen? Why does this happen? everyone gets questions on it. So my first of the question is, should this be a voluntary cooperation rather than a legal raid with a search warrant coming into a private residence?
Well, thank you, Senator, for that question. I want to be clear that as the nominee for this position, I have not been briefed on any of the details of what has happened, so I have no information about those decisions or the sequence of events. But as I understand it, when there is some concern about missing or damaged records in general at the National Archives, at that point in time, the records, to retrieve the records, there is a voluntary exchange of communication with those individuals. And as I understand it, once again, I don't have any past knowledge of this, the vast majority of the time the records are recovered and retrieved.
Right. This is unprecedented for a former president, obviously, to be able to go through this. The reason I ask you is because that has now set a new precedent that going forward, this is going to be the new standard for every president after this. And so this starts a very different process that we're trying to evaluate. The second part of my question on this is, this is the National Archives, the keeper of all records on this. Now the email chains, the conversations, any notes that were done for the National Archives in their communication with the FBI about this now become national historical records and are not only important to be able to maintain and to be able to protect, but also for the visibility of this committee as well. It's the reason that Senator Scott and I have both reached out to this committee to be able to say, we need to be able to talk about this because there was something entirely new that was just created by the National Archives and the FBI in searching a former president's house. Will you agree to, in the future, making records available at the National Archives to be able to show what the process was and the decision-making was to be able to reach to this point so they'll have greater transparency for the American people?
Yes, thank you, Senator, for that question. Yes, I believe that transparency with this committee, I want to be responsive to requests if I am confirmed as Archivist of the United States. Once again, I do want to state I don't know where we are in this Department of Justice law enforcement process. But as a general statement, Senator, you have my commitment that I will work with you and members of this committee to be as transparent as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lankford. Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with you, Shogun, if I could. You have talked throughout today's hearing so far and in your pre-hearing Q&A about how much it's important to be a nonpartisan leader. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
And so if you're confirmed, you will attempt to stay politically neutral in your decision-making. Is that fair to say?
Yes, Senator.
Fair characterization of your views, I should say.
Yes, yes.
So I was troubled, I have to say, by this article that you wrote that Senator Portman asked you about a minute ago, published by the American Political Science Association. I have it here, Anti-Intellectualism in the Modern Presidency, Republican Populism, published in June of 2007. Do you consider this piece to be nonpartisan?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I consider it to be an academic article, publication of 16, 17 years ago, a scholarly piece.
Yeah, let's dig into it a little bit. You write in your paper that to combat allegations of elitism, recent Republican presidents have adopted anti-intellectualism. How would you define anti-intellectualism?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. The ability to speak in very plain, common sense terms to Americans.
So you say recent Republican presidents, but your case studies are Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan, and then coming up, I think, to George W. Bush. So what's the point here? I mean, you say at one point Republicans tend to exhibit anti-intellectual qualities. Democrats, on the other hand, coalesce on the intellectual tail of the continuum. So is the point that Republicans are stupid and Democrats are intellectual?
Yes, thank you, Senator, for that question. Absolutely not. The point of the article is that the presidents that I featured in it have a rhetorical connection with the American people.
A rhetorical connection that you say is anti-intellectual, and you feature every two-term Republican president, going back to Dwight Eisenhower.
Yes, Senator, I think it's a piece on rhetoric, and it is really looking at how these presidents have been successful rhetorically in their arguments.
Interesting. It's a piece on rhetoric, but you attribute part of the anti-intellectualism of the Republican Party to, in your words, the rise of the religious right. Tell me about that. Is it because those voters are stupid?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. Absolutely not. And if I am confirmed as Archivist of the United States, I look forward to welcoming all Americans to the National Archives.
So do you think that people who voted for Donald Trump are anti-intellectual?
Thank you, Senator. I would not make any judgment on the people who voted for President Trump or any other president.
So you don't think the people who voted for Dwight Eisenhower or Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush, they weren't anti-intellectual? The anti-intellectual rhetoric just appealed to them because what? What's your theory?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. As I said, presidents are able to speak in common sense, plain terms to Americans that they understand.